thank you very much, Romilly. That's two very useful presentations. Gives us a bit of an overview. I'm conscious that we had to be rather hasty before lunch, and we were discussing with some of our colleagues from the Rising Powers, and maybe it's an opportunity if there are questions left over from that session to also put some of those on the table. Let's take questions from the floor then, if I may. Yes, please. First here.
Thank you, Stefan Hirsch, BMZ. In the flows, the complex flows that you incorporated, you said climate finance is in there. Judith mentioned in the last panel that we don't look at security spending as well. We don't have the full picture and we have a big hole. So why is it only climate and no other global public good?
Thank you. And over there next. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Marianne and Romilly, for the very good presentations. I would like to...
Would you just mind reintroducing yourself? I'm sorry.
I'm Juanita from the Colombian International Cooperation Agency. I would like to seek your perspectives on if does flows matter or do development results matters, because I think the panel title is clear on new actors, new flows, but I will say better other actors, other flows. So I would like to see your points of view on that. And Romilly, you mentioned that the philanthropic information, you talk about that on your presentation. And from the Colombian experience, we also have the same kind of conclusion. And I would like to know if it's the problem of, do we have the whole picture of what is going on development as a whole, or we are seeking only ODA information, concessional, non-concessional. But what happens if we bring those other actors into the scene and on board in order to have the whole picture towards development results? Thank you.
And Romilly, when you respond to that, one thing I was intrigued by was actually how you set about looking for philanthropic flows. I think that's quite interesting. Lars.
Thanks. It's also to you, Romilly. Perhaps a little bit in line with the last question, namely remittances from migrants and foreign direct investment. Shouldn't they be included somewhere in the picture? Because I think that would make a huge difference. And also, Marianne, I would like to ask, you just mentioned the oil that you found in, I think similar things happen in Mozambique, in Tanzania, with different kinds of natural resources. Aren't we talking about a game changer here with respect to the role of aid if we see a future with substantially more natural resource exploitation in some of these countries?
First there, and then Professor Lee.
Yes, I'm Gunnar Bo from NORAD Oslo. To Romilly, I was a bit disturbed, and it's along the same line here, on this strategic approach to financial flows. Picking concessional before less concessional, before domestic resource mobilization, indicating that concessional financing is not a stimulus at all. It's not a stimulus, it's not stimulating domestic resource mobilization to an extent that it could be to undermine it. I would like your comments to those findings, because they are disturbing.
Professor Lee?
My question is to Mariana about the Ghana case. And as far as I remember, maybe I'm wrong, you talk about this $3 billion case. And I...
$3 billion.
Yeah, $3 billion China Development Bank loan. And I saw that was that actually present a very clear picture of difference between dark donors and China, because that law was holding for some time and was really concerned by dark members for some time. The Chinese ambassador in the country said, I don't understand the country which like to borrow money from other country need to get another group country's agreement. So my question for you is that can you tell us a little bit insight and how you deal with that kind of, I'm not going to say conflict, that kind of difference, because that represents exactly the how dark members and China working together with different modalities, because this development finance, could be very effective for development than the development aid. So my question is just simply to see how you're going to perceive that difference.
Thank you. Neil?
Thanks, and two questions to Mary Ann, and the first question is very similar to the question that has just been asked. I mean, it appears to me that the 3 billion loan from China is your first step towards reducing your dependency on aid. I mean, do you see this as part of that strategy? I mean, you've gone out, you've identified a borrowing requirement, you've managed to secure 3 billion for economic investments in the productive sectors. Surely that sets your country up to even further reduce its dependency on aid. So question, is it your view that the 3 billion is in fact part of that reduction in aid dependency? It's a loan, it's not aid. And then the second question is, in the productive investments or the economic investments that are being undertaken, and many of them in the productive sectors, do you have it in your strategy when that transfer of skills and transfer of technology is going to take place? Because I mean, it's one thing, having these loans to build roads, to build energy power stations, etc. It's another thing also developing your own country's capacity to compete in order to participate in what is an economic activity that's probably been lacking in your country for a long time. Thank you.
I think that's enough questions for one moment. We'll come back to the others who've asked the floor in a minute. Let's give Romilly and Marianne an opportunity to reply. Marianne, do you want to speak first?
Yeah, okay. All right, thank you very much. Interesting questions. I knew that the 3 billion loan would be of interest. Okay, let me start by trying to go backwards. When we started talking about contracting this loan from China, I think what needs to be understood is that Ghana has an IMF program. So looking at your macroeconomic stability, your debt sustainability, etc., we needed to get the approval of those with whom we had the program before we could actually go ahead and get it. It's part of the conditions of our IMF program and so on. And that is why it needed to be taken to the World Bank board. But I do understand that the discussion there was quite positive, and the discussion was not a long-lasting one over 2 or 3 days, but within a few hours, I think the debate was over and we'd been given the approval. So I think that is a positive sign. I think the most difficult part for us before we got that far was actually internal. And it was the Parliament of Ghana that really, took especially it was, I think, the opposition, really took the current government to the cleaners over this loan. I mean, there was a stalemate and it went back and forth. I can't remember how many months it took before Parliament agreed that, yes, we could take a step towards going in for this facility. So it's been subjected to a lot of scrutiny, and that is why a lot of us feel we can't afford to let it fail, okay? We have a master facility agreement, and within that agreement, although we have the loan and we've outlined the various areas that it'll be used for, each time we want to actually undertake an activity, it has to have a separate, I don't know what you call it, maybe a protocol or an agreement that is within, okay? So that is where the question of how are we working on this technology transfer, skills transfer come in. The master facility simply outlines the various parameters for utilizing the loan, but each individual agreement will then spell out how we expect these things to be done. And yes, I think it is a step towards reducing aid dependency. But even more than that, and as Richard kindly reminded me last night, I think we already took a step towards reducing our aid dependency in 2008 when we went to the bond market, by which time we were really at the end of our IMF program, and the then government was determined not to go back for an IMF program. We were really trying to stand on our own 2 feet. I mean, things have changed since then. I mean, the financial crisis happened and so on, so the new government felt they had no choice but to go back into a program. But yes, it is a step towards reducing our dependency on aid. The issue about oil and if it is a game changer. Well, I believe that if we use it properly, it should be a game changer for us. Thankfully, its use has been really legislated. I can't give you the details I can't remember the details offhand, but I do know that we can't just get up and, okay, now that we're selling the oil, it just comes into the budget and then we use it. No, there's so many, there's so much earmarking that has gone into what needs to be done, including setting some aside for future generations. As I said, it's only a 30-year span. Okay, if we use it all now, what happens to the future? So we do need to use it properly, and yes, it could also help towards reducing, again, our dependency on aid if we use it rightly. And I must say that it's not really the oil that will bring us very much, it's more the gas, okay? And so a lot of care is being taken in developing the arrangements for the gas and the protocols. Okay. And I think, Juanita, you were asking, and I think if I can just sort of be very basic, what is important? Is it the aid flows or is it the results? I think the flows are important. I talked about the fact that we have a financing gap. But also, yes, the results are important. And I like what our colleague from China said today, okay? You take a loan, you're constructing a road, you have the road, for example, or you have X or Y. That is not to say that non-DAC donors don't also deliver roads or hospitals or something. They do that. So I think, yes, just making sure that you do have whatever you've asked, you've contracted the loan for is important. So I think both are important, and I can't say one is more important than the other, because for a developing country, you know that you need both. I think those are the things that I took down, but if I've left out something, you can always remind me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Romilly.
Thanks, Richard. There was one question again from Juanita on philanthropy and do we have the whole picture? I'm not sure we do, to be honest, because it is incredibly hard to get data on philanthropy. You asked, Richard, how we got it. It was a combination of looking at some of the global figures, for example, US Foundation Center, also then searching individual foundations like Gates and Rockefeller and Hewlett and so on to find out what they were doing, and then also corroborating that at country level. So we are not sure on the figures, to be honest. Having said that, interviews at country level, including with NGOs, did suggest that volumes were fairly small. Cambodia, somebody said 5 to 10% of funding. So that's not a statistic, but that was the picture we were also getting at country level. I will just say on the philanthropy, I think one of the big difference between our figures and Homi's figures is that, as I understand it, his figures include NGO support, so private funding through NGOs, which we didn't include in our complex flow. So that is one of the...
So you're using philanthropy in the sense
So
of
we're
foundations.
using, exactly, a narrower definition. So that would be one of the reasons why we would come out with such a different figure. But I think, we need to know more. Very much agree with Marianne and on, yes, we need to monitor both flows and results. Obviously, one is easier to monitor than the other, but it has to be about both, absolutely. A couple of suggestions about what do we put in this definition of complex flows and what's in and what's out. security spending, I think that's a really interesting suggestion. I don't know whether we would have the data on it, but it's certainly something to look into. I know that in Ethiopia it's potentially quite a big issue, but how transparent it would be, I don't know. Remittances and FDI, we decided not to look at because we were trying to look at things that would be most similar to ODI. That's why we call it ODA. It's not ODI. Yes, obviously, we're so grandiose. Sorry, it's late in the day. Yeah. Most similar to ODA, and that countries might manage in a more similar way to ODA to try and understand some of the challenges at country level. So I think there's a whole nother interesting piece of work around how do countries deal with remittances, how do countries deal with FDI, but we didn't feel that that was really in the scope of the study. The question about Ethiopia and it being the domestic resource mobilization issue, as I understand it, Ethiopia actually does have a lot of domestic resources and is fairly not as aid dependent as some other countries. So I don't think we should be that worried that it's not actually seeking to mobilize resources, but I think it has a very ambitious development strategy. So I think, as Marianne was saying, it's kind of looking any which way to try and find resources to fund that strategy, and hence the example that I was giving. I think that was it for me. Was there anything else?
Yes. What about our Norwegian colleague?
That was about the strategic approach in Ethiopia.
Okay, right. I think you were next.
Thank you, Chair. My name's Sam Attridge. I work for the Commonwealth. Marianne, Romilly, thank you very much for some insightful presentations. I just really want to probe Marianne, really, if you don't mind. Your perspective on post-2015 and drawing on some of the discussions that we've had throughout the day. And basically, we've got huge needs, a huge financing gap, and if we don't get kind of preoccupied with ODA and all the different flows, but basically there are lots of actors and flows, and I'd like to understand from Marianne kind of a perspective on should and how and what would it look like these kind of new actors or flows, all actors, all flows being involved in post-2015. And I'm coming from, we're very much interested at the Commonwealth. One of the MDG problems was the poor articulation of the Global Partnership for Development. And so in the post-2015 framework, should we be moving towards, I mean, there are lots of higher order framework design issues, but if there was something on financing, any views from a country perspective on kind of how we could be responding to these kind of new challenges? Thank you.
Jonathan.
Thanks very much. Jonathan Glennie from ODI. I've written a lot about aid dependency and the negative impacts of aid dependency and the importance of reducing it, so that's a given for me. But what I'd like to ask, actually I'm very interested in this China deal that I didn't know about. I can't quite see why it's a good thing to be reducing aid dependency but becoming dependent on a huge loan from China. Or put it another way, becoming dependent, reducing dependence on free money or very cheap money and increasing dependence on more expensive money. I don't see why that is necessarily progress. And the second question related to that as well is, I mean, I've argued often that countries need to reduce aid dependency. But again, I don't see why countries would want to, if we stop using the word aid and start using the word international cooperation, why one would want to exit from the world of international cooperation when actually we ought to be increasing international cooperation and changing the way that it operates so that Ghana, which is still an incredibly poor country, continues to receive international cooperation of a very substantial amount for a very long time. And I think we sometimes elude aid dependency with aid. Reduce aid dependency, but make sure you still benefit from the importance of aid.
Thank you. Andrew.
Thank you. First to declare, this is on. Yeah? First to declare an interest. I was involved in the Ethiopia case, but also just to add that both the Ghana case and to some extent the experience of Ethiopia, which was also borrowing massively on quasi-commercial terms, on Exim Bank terms, effectively, from China, illustrate this transitional problem that we have, that countries have, as very well illustrated by Marianne, graduation in name, but in practice don't have full market access or may have restricted market access. Even Zambia had floated some bonds recently, but it may be episodic. So if you're defining that useful money that has some of the attributes of aid enables you to grow fast, if you have good things to invest it in which earn a rate of return, is anything which you can get your money hands on and have a reasonable chance of repaying, and even the IMF says you can repay it, so who are we to challenge it? Then the band, the orange band in Romilly's chart, which includes all DFIs, loan terms, climate finance and everything else, the so-called other official flows, gets enormous. And as we know, and as we were told, reminded by Andrew Steer earlier, it can be only a few basis points difference. In practice, the kind of export finance terms that we're talking about can be 200 or 300 basis points different. If we start talking about that, then there's a whole of the OECD's export finance function that can potentially come into play. And that's, you know, a completely different ballgame. So we need some way of dealing with this world where it may very well be in a national interest to take stuff which is definitely not a giveaway, but maybe a very good thing to get hold of.
I certainly think that there's a danger in having a discussion which makes too much of an opposition between what counts as ODA and other flows which are, broadly speaking, developmental in purpose but have a range of different concessionalities attached to them, including export credits and mixed credits. I mean, some of what I hear about donors is very reminiscent to what European donors were doing in the 1980s. I was involved in running the British mixed credit program, and you know, I'm still burnt by the consequences. But I think there's probably not been enough, again it comes back to Judith's point about disaggregation, enough intelligent analysis of this band of alternative ways in which you can finance yourself through various means which are wouldn't meet the concessionality test but are quasi-development in purpose. Matthew.
Thanks for the very good presentations. I confirm a lot of what we found in other research, notably some of the stuff that you pointed out about why countries appreciate non-DAC providers more, but also the fact that very little of the philanthropy via foundations actually reaches country level. Most of it is either going via global funds or dealing with global public goods. So actually, yes, it's true looking at it from, we did a big study of philanthropy for the DCF, which basically came to the same conclusion, that it was not really representing a transfer of resources to developing countries very much.
Well, just to pause on that point, I mean, if you like, it's more like philanthropy, it's multilateral aid as opposed to bilateral. If they give money to the global fund gives money to you.
But I'm saying there's very little that goes directly to the country. I had two questions. One was, is this really, and particularly directed to Marianne, is this really a decision to reduce aid dependence, or just a strategic planning of trying to match financing with different types of projects with different types of returns? I remember the Vietnamese saying to me a few years ago, and they seem to have it really well organized there, that they like DAC money for the social sector projects because it's cheap, those are low return projects, it keeps their government focused on health and education and social protection and so on. And then they take Chinese money and other slightly more expensive money for infrastructure and so on. So they've done a deliberate plan without saying we're reducing our aid dependence. They are, it's one of their goals, but the fundamental thing is to get the right money for the right project. So is that not also part of it? And then I suppose to Romilly, really the question, but also partly to Marianne, Romilly, you were saying that you sounded rather disappointed that the rising powers are not participating in the aid coordination mechanisms. No. But I've seen in a lot of countries that that's a deliberate choice by the recipient countries, that they are really playing a bit of a game of divide and rule. And I've had, heads of state and finance ministers express that to me quite strongly. We don't want them all in the same room because then they might gang up on us. And so, is it? But then I note that Ghana is trying to push for that, and I note that Zambia has indeed tried to push. Well, eventually, they've ended up, it seems to me, with about 3 different parallel systems for mutual accountability. But in the beginning, their idea was to bring everybody into the same room. So, should we? What's the ideal there? Should we be trying to get everybody in the same room for some of the convergence and working together reasons we discussed in the South-South session this morning, or does it not really matter very much?
Judith? No, we have a mic.
We need it for the recording.
I wanted to ask Romilly how much you talk to people other than governments about their views of these other forms of finance, as well as about how much they were. And I don't know whether the discussion in the paper is framed in the same way as the discussion in here, which seems to me largely about which model do you like best. And I'm not sure that's the right question, because the question must be, you've got a whole, rather following up on Matthew's point just now, you've got a whole set of different sources of finance. How do you lever them, combine them, complement, bring them in together to get the whole to be more than the sum of its parts, as opposed to a sort of narrow choice? And with ODA loans, for instance, the ability to access commercial credit may be accelerated by having received ODA loans in the past. So there are all sorts of combinations that I think are the really interesting thing in terms of the new sources of finance. The other thing I wanted to raise is a bit more of a philosophical, existential question, so it includes Richard in the in the people to whom I'm addressing it. Notwithstanding, I'm sure I like Romilly and Marianne's views as well. I don't think it's in the least surprising that you found that governments thought that DAC donors' assistance was less aligned, because DAC donors come with a whole set of norms, and some of them very legitimate norms about human rights, about gender, about views about governance, about views about priorities. And I wonder about the extent to which we've papered over the legitimacy or otherwise of those things by talking about ownership as though it's the only thing. The presenter from the Mandela Institute, don't know whether he's still here, but unless I misheard him, what he said this morning was, unsurprisingly again, that governments don't always prioritise extremely poor people. Of course they don't. But that doesn't necessarily mean that one should align with that policy, does it? So I'm interested in your reflections on that.
Thank you very much. I think you are next.
Hi, my name is Helen from GIZ, the German implementing agency. Just as we ended within this discussion with alignment, I was actually wondering how do you define alignment in this study? Because I think what was really new for me anyway in this study is that emerging countries are aligning actually to country systems, for example. So I'd like to know more about that. How did you define it actually? And then another point to the strategic approach that you mentioned. Well, I was wondering, I mean, you called it a strategic approach of Ethiopia. Now, I was wondering myself, strategic approach depends on what your goal is. And if your goal is sustainable development, I would say that, and I'm convinced about that as an economist, I think that your domestic revenue is much more important than the revenues or the incomes, whatever you get from external flows.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Thomas Juhl Thomsen. I'm from Danida, so I'm one of the traditional DAC donors, represent one of those, and of course I'm one of the old friends, and happy that we'll still be friends in the future. But I knew that already. My question maybe is building a little bit on the two previous questions, because I think if I'm looking for the answer to the question, okay, what are you looking for from the traditional DAC donors in the future? What I'm getting, of course, is very clearly that you'd like more use of government system. You'd like use the procurement system, budget support, sector budget support as much as possible. But beyond that, what can you tell us about what you see from the traditional DAC donors, more in terms of, you can say, is there anything to say about the focus of our support, the quality and the content of the partnership, which we should think about in the future? What would be your preferences? What should change? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, you've stimulated a lot of interest in the room, so let's wind up now by passing it back first to Romilly this time.
So I realised I made a double mistake, which is putting myself last and then also allowing the longest time for questions for my own presentation. So I note to self for next time. But very interesting questions. Judith's point about, yes, who do we talk to, and also the limits of ownership. We did talk to a whole range of stakeholders in country. We talked to parliamentarians, to NGOs, to new and old donors, as well as government. So we really tried to get a range of views. On this question of ownership, yes, I mean, I agree, and I think it's a tension that we still really haven't squared as an international community, that we go around talking about the importance of ownership, and yet we do like human rights, and we do like gender equality and poverty reduction and all these things. And I think particularly in Cambodia, it's a real tension, because actually the government's doing all sorts of things that are not very consistent with human rights, and I think they are getting away with it more because they're getting more support from China. So it is, you know, the impact of that on developmental outcomes is a bit uncertain. But if we've all agreed, which I thought we had, that, you know, ownership is critical, that does seem to be strengthened. But I think it's an ongoing debate, to be honest. It's quite difficult. The GIZ question, how we defined alignment, it particularly came out in terms of the policy alignment and particularly sort of sectoral allocations. Interestingly, Cambodia was not so interested in systems alignment, so that wasn't a priority for them, I think, because they had fairly limited ambitions on how much could reasonably be expected to be channeled through country systems. That's going to be different in different countries, but I think it was the policy alignment that came out quite strongly. Oh yes, and Matthew's point, you know, I think there's lots of reasons why countries don't want new actors in aid coordination mechanisms. I definitely think divide and rule is part of it. I think in Cambodia, again, in some of those mechanisms, the country didn't necessarily think that they were all that important, so they sort of felt like, actually, we'd rather do a deal directly with the donor and not mess around. And I think the other thing is that obviously lots of these mechanisms tend to focus on policy dialogue, conditionality, agreeing joint monitoring indicators, all that kind of thing. And if you're a donor that's fairly unconditional, that's not so relevant for you. So I think there's a mixture of motives. Just the last point on aid dependency, what I found interesting in the studies is that there did seem to be a push to try and reduce dependency, particularly on traditional ODA, but that seemed, I can't confirm this 100%, but what seemed to be coming is that was more from the push factor than the pull factor, in the sense that Zambia is already a MIC, Cambodia will probably become a MIC fairly soon. So they were very conscious of, we may not be getting as much ODA as we have been previously, therefore we need to diversify. We didn't pick up in those countries a really strong push for saying we don't want to be so dependent on ODA. It was more, we think the money's going to stop coming, or in Zambia's case, it has stopped coming to some extent. But I think that's also very country specific.
Thank you very much, Romney.
From me.
Marianne.
Okay. I'll take two of the points, the two last points. Okay. On the, I think, Romney, when you were talking, you said something about, you know, the aid coordination. I'm not so sure that I would say it's a deliberate policy of divide and rule, although that may not necessarily be a bad thing to do divide and rule. I recall, and someone told me this, shortly after our independence, I think Ghana wanted to build a dam, okay? And so spoke to the US, and it was too expensive, we can't afford that. And so the president says, oh good, okay, I'll go to Russia. And that was it, all right? So the support came from the United States. You know, so divide and rule may not always be a bad thing, but you know, you've got to play your cards rightly. But in the aid coordination debate and bringing them in, you're quite right. The DAC donors always want to talk about, you know, well, these conditionalities, whatever. And if it's sort of interest to them, to the BRICS, why would they come for the meetings? So even in Ghana, even as we say we're bringing them in, I keep saying it depends on the agenda for the meeting. If you have an agenda that is of no interest to the BRICS, why do you force them in and try to put them in one sort of suit? You know, I don't know what to say. We have bilateral agreements with all these various countries. They're not multilateral agreements. Now, in the aid coordination thing, you're trying to go sort of multilateral at the country level that way. It may not work with them. Certainly for the last consultative group meeting, they were quite anxious to be there. They were interested. They engaged, but they did not engage in policy discussions. They would share experiences. They would say, well, in China or in Brazil, we did it this way or that way. Whereas the DAC donors wanted to get into policy, into other discussions. So really, it's not a question of just forcing them in. but just making sure that whatever the discussion is, it suits the country's own purposes. At least that's the way that I see it. Okay. And then the aid dependency issue. Again, you talked about it. Middle income status. Clearly, as far back as 2010, the DAC donors signaled to us in Ghana, oh, we're going to be pulling out. And we said, listen, you can't pull out now, okay? Just because overnight I've become a middle-income country does not mean that I've got everything. So you need to stay with us. And it's been a very hard, a very difficult discussion to finally get them to the point where they agree, okay, we'll stay now for 10 years, starting from this year. So already we are being pushed to find other sources of financing. It's not a question of, okay, we don't want the free money and quote free money. There's no free lunch, okay? But it's just being realistic, knowing that they are going to pull out in one way or the other. And I don't think we should wait till the last day before we start thinking, okay, so now, how do I go about for, getting non-concessional financing? I need to start practicing that now, even as they are with us. And in that sense also, you're also looking at, okay, how do I reduce dependency? But then why did we go for the 3 billion facility? I mentioned at the beginning, it is to develop certain areas, certain projects. I'll give you an example. Railway rehabilitation and modernization. That's one of the things that we're going to use the funds for. I remember 5 years ago having a discussion with some of the DAC donors. Oh, it'll be too expensive. End of story. End of story. They are not interested. China is interested, so why don't I go for that? So it's a question of what you need. Where we want to develop the railway is in the western region where the oil has been found. You're going to need some good forms of transportation. We don't even have very, very good roads there. We're now working on that. So you have to be pragmatic, you have to be realistic about what you need the financing for. It's not just because you want to go to China and discard old friends. Ghana doesn't discard old friends, I can assure you. Okay. So Danida, we will not discard Danida. Although Danida did threaten to pull out of budget support, I think you're still in there. It's a good discussion. But I wouldn't want to compare support from the BRICS vis-a-vis support from the DAC donors. Everyone has a niche and everyone has a role to play, okay? So what we want from DAC donors, those of you who do budget support, we're asking for more budget support. It is important. You are telling us we're going to give less. So that discussion is still ongoing and, well, eventually it probably will get your way. But I think it's a reality. It happens, okay? But I think in terms of the assistance, many of the things we negotiate bilaterally, we agree on certain areas, it's all within our development plan. For me personally, and this is now my own view, I think the level of, for want of a better word, disruption to my work is rough, okay? I'll give an example. I was almost pulled from not flying out was it Monday night? Mm-hmm. Although the approval had been given, say, 2 months ago. Why? Because all of a sudden, the donors want some information. It has to come from us. We don't have a proper automated system. So we're working on it, but it's not ready. And so when I go to tell my boss, oh, you know I'm leaving tonight, it's like, but we are not done yet. Some of these demands. You're working on your national budget.
Absolutely.
This is your quiet period, and yet the demands come. We want to field a mission. I mean, honestly, I wouldn't want to be the Minister of Finance. Never, ever. Because I don't think he has time to focus on why he was made Minister of Finance, okay? Which is to look after the finances of the country. You look at his agenda. Every day, this donor or that one wants to have a discussion with it. It is just too much. We need to look at how to reduce all these transaction costs. I know from your perspective, you need to have this interaction, you need to give feedback back to your capitals. We have to find a balance as to how to work without all of us feeling tired. I mean, I'm just feeling exhausted as I speak, thinking of all, I'm sorry, thinking of all the meetings and everything. Sometimes my real work, the actual Ministry of Finance work I'm supposed to do, I don't start on it till about 6 or 6:30 in the evening, because you spend the whole day in one meeting after the other. It just isn't realistic. I mean, it's not practical. We have to find a better way of working. Samantha, you're trying to put me on the spot. Well, I cannot say that we've started a full discussion on, within Ghana on what should go into post-2015. But I do know that we're looking at, people have been saying to me, but we're not even going to achieve the MDGs. So we get to 2015, we throw that away, and then what happens next? Are we going to look at a way of putting reframing the MDGs, those that haven't been achieved, those that are maybe unachievable, we find another way of doing that, into the new framework? And I think that's where we need to start. In terms of the financing perspectives, I'm sorry I don't have an answer. We haven't come that far in discussing, but since you're pushing, I'll make sure that we get that discussion going now, okay? So I guess, I think I have answered everybody's question. Yeah.
I think you've been extremely faithful. Thank you very much indeed. I think a couple of takeaways from this session. I think, first of all, what we're hearing from all four countries, Ghana and the three that you've mentioned, is that actually the country appears to be operating in quite a smart way. It realizes it's got a set of choices. It's setting us up to deal with that. I think the big risk is about, as countries move gradually to better income status and have to access more non-concessional funding, then the demands for is the investment a really good one? Is it going to be properly carried out? Is it going to have a rate of return? Are we going to avoid getting themselves back into debt? Becomes a crucial issue. I work in Oxford quite a lot with Paul Collier, and he's got a nice phrase that what we need is a program for investing in investing. His thesis is that rather than put all the, say, the Ghana oil money in some offshore fund, what it should be invested in is infrastructure in Ghana. But that requires a pool of properly organised projects which are really high priority, which don't just look good because the consultant said so and all the rest of it. Many of us have been involved in capital projects, and many of us have seen bad results from those. You really have to be extremely strict about how projects are managed. China's done an extremely good job domestically on this, and I think that that's the test. If you and it's shocking to me that Marianne still can't start her proper work till 6 in the evening. I remember her finance minister saying at the Accra high-level forum, 70% of my money is coming from the Ghanaian taxpayer, and that's where my time should be spent. But donors don't care. They want to ask silly questions again in a dysfunctional way. And donors have a lot to answer for, in my opinion. And there's a lot more work to be done in just behaving in a decent way. I think the Tanzanians had it right 5 or 6 years ago when they said they were not going to entertain any donor missions for a period of months while they were sorting their budget. And I think more assertiveness by, I think Ghana's quite good at being assertive, but there are many countries that are not as assertive as they need to be to really bring the donors to heel here, and that would be my takeaway. Anyway, I've now broken my promise to let you go by 5:30, so I'll let you go at 5:25 to 6. Thank you very much.